What if a book about one of the greatest scientific breakthroughs of all time wasn't just about the facts, but was actually filled with drama, ambition, and a whole lot of controversy? Well, today we're digging into a book that did exactly that, and it completely changed how we think about the process of discovery itself.
All right, let's get right into it. The book is James Watson's 1968 classic, The Double Helix. Now, on paper, it's his personal story of how he and his partner Francis Crick figured out the structure of DNA, a discovery that literally reshaped all of biology.
But from the moment it came out, it was also deeply, deeply controversial. And this quote really gets to the heart of why. The book was immediately called out for being, quote, disagreeably sexist, especially in how it talked about a key colleague, the brilliant chemist Rosalind Franklin.
So that's the big question, right? How can one book be a celebrated classic and a source of such fierce debate? Well, here's how we're going to break it down. We'll look at why it was so groundbreaking to begin with, then get into the story behind the story, see how the controversy kicked off, dive into the specific case of Rosalind Franklin, and finally, try to make sense of its complicated legacy.
Okay, first up, a groundbreaking science story. Before we get into all the drama, let's just establish why this book is considered such a landmark in the first place.
So what made this book so different wasn't just the science, it was the style. See, instead of some dry, stuffy academic paper, Watson wrote a really candid, first-person memoir. He shared his frustrations, his private thoughts, his totally unfiltered opinions about people. For science writing back then, this was, well, it was radical. It was subjective and intensely personal in a way nobody had really seen before.
And the impact was just huge. This wasn't a book just for scientists. It became a genuine cultural touchstone. I mean, think about it. For a science memoir to be ranked as one of the best nonfiction books of the century, or for the Library of Congress to call it a book that shaped America, that's incredible. It totally crossed over from the lab into the mainstream conversation.
But here's the twist. That unique, personal style that made the book such a hit, yeah, that's also the very thing that made it so controversial. This is where we get to the real story behind the story.
Watson really focused on the human drama of science. He painted the discovery of DNA not as some stately march of progress, but as a frantic, messy race. It was all about the rivalries, the egos, and that burning desire to get the glory for being the first one to solve the puzzle. And as you can probably guess, this personal approach immediately caused a total firestorm. So let's look at how the controversy started, which was actually happening even before the book hit the shelves.
It's a really fascinating question, isn't it? How can a book be both a celebrated classic and a source of scandal? Well, the answer, believe it or not, comes from the very people who were in the room with him, his own collaborators.
Okay, get this. The book was originally supposed to be published by Harvard University Press, but Watson's own partners, Francis Crick and Maurice Wilkins, protested so strongly against his portrayal of them that Harvard actually dropped the book. The key figures in the story were literally trying to stop it from being published. It did eventually find a new home, but wow, what a start. This quote from critic Burton Feldman really captures why they were so upset. Watson's personal impressions came across as these dismissive, unfair caricatures, and his portrayal of one scientist in particular was seen as way, way over the line.
And that brings us to the absolute heart of the controversy, the book's depiction of Dr. Rosalind Franklin, the brilliant scientist whose work was completely essential to the discovery.
So for 7 years, Watson's portrayal was pretty much the only one the public knew. But then, in 1975, author Anne Sayer published this powerful counter-narrative, a book written specifically to correct the record and reclaim Franklin's story.
Sayer's critique was just methodical. First, she argued that Watson's description of Franklin wasn't just unflattering, it was a sexist caricature. Second, and this was a bombshell, she questioned the ethics of how Watson and Crick even got to see Franklin's unpublished data in the first place. And finally, she made the case that Franklin's critical contributions had been systematically downplayed, denying her the credit she deserved.
And here is where the story takes another really interesting turn. In an epilogue to later editions of the book, Watson himself addressed the controversy. He admitted, and this is a direct quote, that his initial impressions were often wrong. He went on to praise her superb work and acknowledge the immense barrier she faced as a woman in science. For the author to add that later, it's a pretty striking and complicated admission. So, where does all this leave us? Well, the book's story definitely didn't end in 1968.
It has this complicated, evolving, and enduring legacy that we're still talking about today.
You can actually watch the narrative evolve over time on this timeline. It's like the book became this living document. You have the original, controversial book. Then comes the counter-narrative. After that, academic editions start getting published that include the negative reviews right alongside the text. Decades later, annotated versions add even more context. The book has basically absorbed its own controversy, becoming a conversation that changes with each new edition.
And the story didn't just stay on the page, it jumped right to the screen. It was made into an award-winning BBC film, which turned this whole scientific drama into a case study in ethics, history, and the messy, all-too-human side of discovery.
And that leaves us with this final, really complicated question. Can a book be deeply flawed, biased, and even unfair, and yet still be an essential piece of history? With the Double Helix, it seems the answer is yeah. In a weird way, its flaws are exactly what sparked this crucial, ongoing conversation about credit, bias, and who gets to write the story of science.